Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I want to share with you all the details of an interview I got to do this last weekend at PAX West. I had the pleasure of sitting down with our good old Michael Christopher Koji Fox and asking him a few lore and lyric related questions. Now, there is definitely some overlap here between some of the stuff that he's answered in other interviews that came out of PAX West, as well as some of the stuff he spoke on the lore panel. Just know that I did this before any other articles posted and before the lore panel itself. So let's get into the questions that I had for him and the answers that he had for me. So my first question for him was about Omega, and I definitely asked him a few questions about that. Omega is a character who is pretty explicitly not from Eorzea. As much as he is from the Final Fantasy franchise, he simply has just unbelievable powers in our realm. Were there any challenges in writing him into a believable story? Now keep in mind that Koji Fox's answers are definitely paraphrased here. They are not word for word, so there's going to be some liberties taken on this one. So, his answer to that was, one of the great things about Omega is how very clearly he is not from Eorzea. It was mentioned at a previous live letter, but we wanted him to be very sci-fi, science fiction based, or sci-fi feeling, and because of his origins, we're able to really push that theme. His origins meaning his origins in the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. Even with not being from Eorzea, he has integrated himself into its history and its future, and that's been a great thing about writing him into Eorzea. In the past, we've explained things like Lightning or the Dragon Quest monsters appearing in Eorzea, and really, Eorzea is the melting pot of the Final Fantasy games, or Final Fantasy XIV is the melting pot of Final Fantasy games. For that reason, people who are loyal to the Final Fantasy series hopefully feel like his appearance makes sense, even if it's a bit out of this world. Overall, it's basically like, it may seem like he doesn't really belong, but to be fair, a lot of crazy stuff happens, and as long as it's explained adequately within our lore, within our story, writing something like Omega is just really a lot of fun. The whole sci-fi feeling is something I feel like they've captured very well, and I'm glad to hear that he's enjoying integrating Omega into the lore that is Eorzea, especially with one of the questions we're going to be answering later. So, question number 2. The next few questions, I asked him about Rise. I asked him about the lyrics. We know that he writes the lyrics to a lot of the songs, so I wanted to get kind of a little bit of background about certain songs, specifically Rise. So, first off, did you both write and rap Rise, the song from A12 Savage? And he gave me a really long answer for this one. So in the case of Rise, I most certainly wrote the lyrics for that one. Soken one day walked into the office and was like, I want to do a sort of rap. You could do that, right, Koji? And Koji said, I proceeded to remind him he was asking a 40-year-old white dude living in Japan if he could rap, and he just nodded his head and asked me again, and thus my journey began. Before that, though, one more comment from Koji Fox. Almost all the lyrics start in English and are then translated to various languages. It's not true every time, but it's pretty often. We're also given a melody or a beat to refer to in most cases, but not this time. So he had a big struggle ahead of him for this one. So, he said he had to channel his inner Vanilla Ice to come up with both the lyrics and the feel for how he was going to rap the song. Now, a lot of people laugh at the whole Vanilla Ice comparison, but he said he uses Vanilla Ice for a few good reasons. One is the style of rap and the pacing of the song. You know, it's very wacky. So, you know, Vanilla Ice songs were pretty wacky, so that's part of it. The other is that, you know, Vanilla Ice, he got ridiculed pretty heavily. A lot of people didn't take him seriously. And Goblins, a lot of people don't take them seriously. So, despite everything they've done, when he said he had to channel his inner Vanilla Ice, there's a few pretty good reasons behind it. That being said, it's all to measure up to being the song for the final encounter of Alexander. Once he got the lyrics down, he then had to learn to rap them. Soga just said, do your best, and we'll fix it if it's not good. So, moving on from there, what ended up happening is that some of the words actually got cut out to fit the actual beat and tempo, which was big because if you have the lyric page, it sounds like there's just words that straight up aren't in the song. So he said the lyrics players have seen are the original lyrics that Koji Fox wrote, but in the final version, a lot of those lyrics aren't present because they just didn't sound good, or they needed to kind of squish the lyrics together in order to make it work. One example I asked him about was in the lyric page, it says question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark at one point. And he says that part of the lyric is actually him swearing. The original lyrics were supercalifragilistic, but it was too long, so in the version we have now, it's supercalifragilistic. And so that's happened in a few places. If you notice later in the song, he also cuts out a few like thes in a few places, and like 3 of the 4 places they exist. So it did have a few of the lyrics cut back, which is why the official lyrics may not seem entirely accurate to what the song itself is actually saying. So Koji said he got the rap down, songs made, moves on to work on other things. Then just before EU FanFest, Soken comes up to Koji and he says, "So, we want to perform Rise at the next fan festival. You could do that, right, Koji?" And at this point, he said he'd really kind of moved on from the song. He wasn't practiced on it at all, plus the edits that had been done earlier. So Koji tried to tell him no, but Soken said, "Well, I already told them we're playing it, and I've given them music sheets already, so you have 2 weeks, Koji." So he said he kind of freaked out, and for the next 2 weeks, he spent like 30 minutes listening to the song on the way home from work every day, and rapping the lyrics out loud to himself. He said he'd been going through the park on the way home, and some guy would see a crazy white guy mumbling to himself, and mutter, "Crazy Gaijin." Oh, you must have a wonderful commute, Koji. It was even worse because he had to learn the lyrics. Basically, he had to learn it to the actual song. We mentioned earlier that lyrics were cut, like certain words and whatnot. So Koji's the one who wrote the song. So for the final song to not have lyrics he wrote, it was almost like learning another song altogether because it wasn't entirely his lyrics. Ultimately, though, he did actually rap the lyrics at the EU Fan Fest. A lot of people seem to think it was like a pre-recorded rapping or it's a taping of him doing it and it's been like modified and whatnot. He says, "No, I wasn't lip syncing. I actually rapped it live." I asked him if he'd like to prove it right then and there, if I like could record it on my phone. And he said that his more honest answer was that he would basically have to go through the process again of relearning it, you know, where he practices it. So he's like, you know, I'd probably have to walk around the convention floor rapping to myself, and everyone would be muttering, "Crazy Gaijin." So he had to decline. He seemed kind of like he wanted to, but he's like, I don't. He wasn't confident he was gonna get it to his own liking. So he kindly declined. As for the lyrics themselves, or who sings the songs, who sings those actual lyrics, I kind of wanted to know what the process was for determining that when going into writing the lyrics for a song. I gave him a few examples just to make sure we were clear. Like I said, I imagine that Rise is being rapped by All Talks. You know, I asked him, you know, can we get confirmation on who is singing Locus and Exponential Entropy? And he said, yeah, it's definitely All Talks. You know, he's going hard on the Warrior Light, and his fellow goblins chime in later in the song. It's kind of how you see the goblins acting in general throughout Alexander. As for how they decide, it kind of depends on what kind of attitude the boss themselves has. Like Sephiroth, he sings it himself. You know, he's got that kind of arrogance about him. Sophia's mostly being sung by her followers, which is kind of plays into her lore and how he ended up coming to encounter her in the first place. And she chimes in herself, you know, later into the encounter. It depends on the boss's attitude. You know, if they're humble, edgy, insane, it just starts changing the way that they want to approach what kind of song it is and who is actually singing the lyrics. If it's going to be like the Primal or the boss themselves, or if it's going to be, you know, someone narrating the story about the boss or whatnot there. And then some songs just straight up do better without lyrics, like Ifrit. I also, like I said, I asked who sang Exponential Entropy and Locus lore-wise, and he said that it's accurate to assume that it's Maid and Dayan, which was what most people had suspected anyway, so it's just nice to get a little bit of confirmation there. Now, I asked him next, as someone who works very hard on world lore, that is one of his primary jobs in the company, what was your experience working with Yasumi Matsuno, who is the father of Ivalice, and fitting in all of these Ivalice elements to fit Eorzea for the upcoming raid? Now, I couldn't get too much out of this because that was the morning of the live letter. So, like, Yasumi Matsuno was going to be joining the 14-hour broadcast later. So, I didn't push this one too hard. So, he said first, regarding to working with Matsuno, he'd only seen or spoken to him once. And that was at FanFest when they announced that he'd be writing the story to Return of Ivalice. He went up and fanboyed a little bit. He's like, "Oh, Matsuno-san, I'm a huge fan of your work. And you've been such an inspiration to me." And then Matsuno realized who Koji was, and he said, "Oh, Koji Fox, I love your work too, and you've done such a good job." And Koji's like, "No, you can't fanboy back at me. Now I feel weird." He says it was a very innocent moment in his life, where as a 40-year-old man, he walked up to someone who he would consider an idol and an inspiration and full out fanboyed. Since then, honestly, Matsuno-san's mostly worked directly with Oda-san, who was recently upgraded to main scenario writer, but still works on the world lore. And then whenever Koji needs to work with something, he usually does it directly through Oda-san as opposed to going directly through Matsuno-san. So Matsuno wrote the quest. He made sure that it worked in Eorzea. He wrote the quest, and then Koji and Oda made sure that it was working in Eorzea. And he said that was really important because this is not a carbon copy of Ivalice, but it has to be as loyal as possible to Ivalice while fitting in Eorzea. So they had a lot of fun making this one work. And overall, Teams' experience was very positive with having Matsuno on the team. He mentioned that they had elements of Ivalice already pop up in Eorzea. Things such as like the Ascians' names, which he didn't want to talk about too much because the Ascians are still kind of a large mystery, a mystery at large. We still have very little inklings as to how far along they are, what their next step is. You know, they are the big mystery factor in Final Fantasy XIV. But he said that they laid a lot of those foundations, and this is something he said a lot, that were familiar to Ivalice a long time ago, before they ever even knew they'd be working on this part of the project. And now it's exciting to revisit them and build on those foundations that they set up so long ago. He was especially excited when they dropped the name Dalmasca in the game, although in some translations, apparently, it didn't come through as prominently at the point he wanted it to. But at least the translations have Dalmasca, and with what Matsuno-san said later at the live letter, it's pretty reasonable that he would come to that conclusion about how he felt about Dalmasca overall. Then the next question we had, so he kept saying, like, I don't have it written down as much here, but he kept talking about laying foundations for future content. And this was true in the lore panel itself. So one foundation that I wanted to know about was Red Mage. I wanted to know how far in advance he was able to lay foundations for that job story in the lore. And also, I quickly asked him, and how about that Geomancer lore drop? And so, at first he said, you may remember when Yoshida was talking about the new jobs at Stormblood. He said that Samurai they knew immediately, but Red Mage took a while before they decided to do it. So obviously they had other jobs in consideration well in advance, since Yoshida had talked about how long it even takes to develop a single job. So they get this information apparently really far in advance, like way before they've ever decided that they are doing something. And in case they do it, they start laying foundations in the lore that they can then build upon should the time come. Obviously, if the world has grown since then, they may have to do some adjustments. But for Red Mage, he loved it. You know, we all know that that he is a big fan of Final Fantasy XI, Koji Fox. So Red Mage probably hits home with him, and he spoke about it a lot this weekend. The idea of the rival factions putting their differences aside, creating a new school of magic, was a very awesome thing to create, you know, considering how much he actually loved writing the lore for that specific calamity. This just builds on that, and it creates something that's a whole nother level that just really feels connected to the world, very believable, and it just feels like it was a natural progression. That's because they laid those foundations so long ago. As for Geomancer, he wouldn't comment on anything there. Obviously, he just does lore, but I had to ask, I was like, so Geomancer, I didn't expect you guys to like drop that in the lore. And he kind of just went, yeah, kind of made me nervous. You know, I asked Oda-san, are you sure we should call it that? And he just kept saying, yeah. So, all right, so I'll do it. You know, it was pretty nice, but no more details than that. I mean, Koji knows how anytime we see like the name of a job or even an inkling, people for 2 years straight start talking about it. And I think he didn't want to be responsible for that. Next question was about Encyclopedia Eorzea. You know, this is something that did really well, and I asked a very simple question. Volume 2, when? He sighed at first. He's like, we get asked this a lot. He's not sighing because he doesn't want to do it. He just remembers all the bugs that he had, like the mistakes that he had in the book itself, and he can't take them back. But he was really touched at the success of Encyclopedia Eorzea. You know, he said personally, he'd really like to do another. He expected maybe a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand at most to sell. But, you know, when you work so hard to create this world and all this lore, and you have those expectations, but then instead like tens or hundreds of thousands of people buy this book, he said it's like an eye-opener. You know, you feel like this world you created, it's really touched a lot of people, and people are really into it, and it's a motivation factor, and he really appreciates every single person who bought Encyclopedia Eorzea. As for Volume 2, he said it's incredibly time-consuming to create the book. You know, they don't get to stop what they're doing in the game and work on the book. They got to work on the book while they're working on the game. So they basically have no lives while they're doing it. Koji honestly wasn't even happy with the final book other than the bugs. He wanted a full index in the back of the book where if you wanted to search the word primal, it would tell you all the pages the word primal popped up on. And Oda-san has experienced guide making, which was talked about a lot in the lore panel too. And so when it comes to indexing, he's pretty familiar with it. And he's like, listen, if you want to do that, We got to hire an intern, have him do it, just read it every day, grab every word, and they would add months and months and months onto the release window. And they weren't going to push it back for just an index. You know, they do have the table of contents at the beginning, so it just wasn't something that was feasible. The demand's clearly there. He wants to do another one. He just wants to make sure there's less bugs in the next one. Sigh again. Then we have, let's see, question number 7 here. So I had actually spoken to him, I believe, 2 PAX Easts ago. I think it was 2 Easts ago specifically. And I walked up to him and I said, so Koji, where's all the books in the Google library? And his response was hilarious. He was like, they wouldn't let me put any books in. I kept saying, yeah, it's a library, you gotta have books in there. And they're like, you can't put any books in there. I was like, I gotta put books in there. He was losing his mind. So we've gotten books in the library since then, but I decided to ask how interested is he in adding like a larger number of interactable lore in general in dungeons. And he's like, I remember that. I was really upset. And Yoshida-san was standing there just laughing at how flustered I was. And that was true. It was great. On a more serious note, it's more of a system issue with loading lots of interactable objects. They also don't have a great means of just submitting it to add it to the dungeon. He'd love to fill the dungeons to the brim with lore, and he's asked the dev team if they could develop a system internally to make adding lore to dungeons in that specific way a little bit easier for them on the back end. He says he hopes they're able to pull it off because, you know, he would really love to do it. You know, he just would love to make these places, give these places sort of a more real touch instead of like 3 or 4 interactables or none at all, depending on the dungeon. Going back to Omega, this was my last kind of real question. The last question's kind of a joke, so... going back to Omega, I just wanted to know how far along Allegan technology was when they first encountered Omega, and how much of it we see is due to his influence. And he didn't want to go into too much details, like since Omega's story is still ongoing, and we have those diary entries that are giving you a hint as to how he was involved with the Allegans. He doesn't want to spoil too much because they want to write it into the story and have people surprised by it. He said basically their technology was already pretty far along, way past what we have now, and Omega just sped up the process. And, you know, probably by extension of speeding up how fast their technology advanced, he probably also facilitated their demise coming even faster, or a quicker fall of the Allegan civilization, just because they had more available to them. So that was the last real question I had. Then I had a request. Question number 9. The final question. At this, Asher asked me to give you a hug and a smooch. Can I? I'm not kidding. I did this. And his answer was great. Koji's like, I have a wife and kids, so... And he turns to Matt and Adam, who's one of the PR guys. He goes, guys? And Matt's like, yeah, I don't think that's gonna fly with PR. I was like, yeah, I think we should just do the hug. And I was like, well... he can't say I didn't ask, right? And so there you go. I got the look at the look on Koji's face. And you know what the best part about this is? I was like, it's good that you can only see Koji's face in it, because Ethis could just pretend that's him. He could just like pretend on the other side of Koji's face is his own face, and then that's it. That's his moment. You know, he got this. Good job at this. I'm so glad you finally got to hug Koji. But anyway, that is going to be a wrap for this video. Thank you again, Square Enix. Thank you, Koji. Thank you, everyone at the community team, the PR teams, for letting us do this interview at PAX West. It was a blast. I enjoyed the lore panel as well. And it's too bad Koji gets locked in a dungeon all the time, because he's a funny dude. He's a nerdy dude, but he's a funny, nerdy dude. And I'm a nerdy dude, so I find his humor quite humorous. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to wrap up this video. I got more to do. Thank you for supporting the channel by watching this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned. We'll see what we can do with interviews. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.